So in what ways then can you say that national policy making as well as responses by the government to issues, how were they reflective of this groupthink psychology?
Oh, I'm not sure that what you're calling groupthink was what was in place. You want to remember here that Mr. Tubman had been president for 27 years. Quite a few of the people who are serving his government were part of the Tolbert government. The Tolbert government tried to distance itself from the Tubman government. So you had a somewhat schizophrenic situation within things. In other words, there were some people who had mental reservations about some of the policies being pursued by the Tolbert government. Mental reservations, I'm not so sure that I agree with it, but I'm part of it, so it would appear that we are all in agreement. I guess that's what you had in mind. You talk about this.
Well, if I should cite an example, for instance, during the crisis of April 14, 1979, there was an occasion where the late Albert Port met with the president in the company of others, and the president had remarked that, or accused Mr. Port of holding secret meetings at his home in Roosevelt with what he called the boys. And there wasn't any cabinet minister or any of those officials around who were there could have said or was able to say, no, Mr. President, I don't think this is the case, or let's examine the issues further, or let's find the evidence and all of that, even though probably he was being fed this information or misinformation, so to speak, by the security agencies. But not one single official dared raise his voice in opposition. Was this not characteristic of this kind of psychology I'm talking about? The president is mad and this is view on this issue, and I dare not differ with him.
Well, again, I don't know who the people were in the office that you are talking about here. It's possible that those particular people who were in there were all of one accord with what the president was saying, and therefore did not dissent. There were many such situations, but I can assure you that there were quite a few people around who had mental reservations, and I should say on the left and on the right, if you get what I'm trying to say, meaning there were people who saw themselves on the right, meaning coming largely from the Tubman era, and on the left, which is increasingly moving away from that era, who had mental reservations about certain things that were going on. And I don't think that, again, we had a problem of consensus, so do we debate, and at the end of the day arrive at a consensus and determine on the basis of that consensus to committedly go forward. I don't think that's how the Liberian government worked at that time.
Now, during the build-up to the riots, and if we can draw parallels to moments of crisis in Liberia as well as the U.S., for example, look at the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s, when the crucial cabinet meeting to decide on the issue, there were those who supported the president, and there were those who did not support President Kennedy. But at the same time, not being, as some political commentators will write later, not being courageous enough to voice their dissent. And finally, when he did make the decision to pull back from the brink of war, everybody breathed with a sigh of relief. How can one draw a parallel to April 14, 1979, for example, in which I'm sure there were opposing views on whether to use force or whether not to use force? What were the views? Which view prevailed? We know in the end that the demonstration turned out violently and people were shot. But what were the views of those calling for or asking for restraint? did this play out in those cabinet meetings?
Again, I will go back to the structures that I referred to earlier on. I'm talking about the structure where the president is a lone person up there with his clerk, and a kitchen cabinet as the second layer, and then the cabinet as a whole as a third layer. I think all along that spectrum you had discussions going on, and it's very likely that the final decision obviously is taken by the president. I don't know of any, and it may have happened that I am unaware of any cabinet discussion about what to do about decisions with respect to the demonstration. I do know that there was a meeting of the cabinet on 8 o'clock on the morning of the 14th. But at that point, activities were already going on. In other words, whatever the decision was had already been made. And I think people were simply bracing themselves at that point for the fallout. In other words, when the ugly reports come in, what then do we do? That's what my sense is of what was happening in that cabinet meeting of 8 o'clock on the morning of April 14, 1979, rather than a meeting to determine we are faced with a crisis, let us debate this crisis, let us reach a consensus about what we do about it, and each one is then giving his marching orders, let's go out and implement the collective decision. I don't see that was the way this decision was taken.
Now, in this immediate aftermath, I would suppose that the government found itself at a loss to fully comprehend why things went the way they went. And I would suppose that the letter written by Dr. Patrick Sayon, which you delivered to the president, I suppose provided him a way out of the crisis as he accepted your proposal to put this commission together and what have you. But what were the discussions in the immediate aftermath? What were the concerns being expressed by the cabinet and other officials of government? And what was the way forward as it appeared at the time in which that seemed to provide itself? And of all the options on the table, which did the president take as a way forward?
Well, I think what you had was the forces of change and the forces of the status quo in play. The forces of the status quo had warned Mr. Tolbert that if he had gone in a certain direction, that what happened on April 14, 79 was likely to result. When it happened, it was like, I told you so. So it was like putting the Jenny back into the bottle. It was like, how can we reverse? Obviously, you can imagine that the forces of change were bewildered, not knowing where to stand, where to go, precisely what to say. I think when I gave you a sampling of one of the cabinet meetings where I pointed out certain ministers were saying certain things, that's how that was played out, where you could, at that point, people were speaking freely, and you could almost divide the place into those who were advocates of change and those who were advocates of the status quo. And I'm afraid that what happened toward the end, and probably one of the precipitating factors to the coup, was that the forces of the status quo basically got back in the driver's seat.